Welcome into another edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. John Alden with you as always. Happy Wednesday, happy hump day, happy whatever it is you may be celebrating here on February 26th in the middle of the week. And if you have something to celebrate, enjoy it. And if you don't, it's okay to have a mundane day as well. Many of us will have more Mondays than we probably ever expect, but that's besides the point. Welcome into the show, and look forward to chatting with you once again. As always, Kyler Staley is going to join us once again, really for the first time in a while on this show. Of course, he and I chat a lot on the post-game wrap-up shows pretty regularly. But he's going to come on, help us preview Penn State tonight and talk a little more big picture stuff when it comes to Indiana basketball, a little head coaching discussion, among other things. So looking forward to sharing that with you guys as always. Also, a couple of non-sports topics that I want to just briefly mention before we get rolling. I'm excited about the Louder Than Life lineup dropping today. And I don't know how many of you guys care about that, maybe none. But if you live in the Kentuckiana area, then you know about the now legendary Louder Than Life Rock and Metal Festival that happens every September here in Louisville. And that lineup will likely be dropping right around whenever the show gets released, I would imagine. So I'm looking forward to that. Maybe some of you guys, if you're around here, looking forward to that as well. I'm sure my man Justin Beard, being a rock and roll guy, I'm sure he'd be looking forward to it. Also, tomorrow, Thursday, I'm going to the dentist for the first time in maybe a year and a half, and that wasn't by design. But sometimes things get away from you, and so I'm nervous about going back to the dentist. And I don't mind the dentist. I actually do find it pretty relaxing whenever things are normal at the dentist. But I'm worried that because it's been, a bit of a long time since I've been to see the dentist, that I'm going to have some potential issues, some cavities or something along those lines. So that's what makes me nervous. But maybe I'm hoping to not have any unfortunate stories to share about my experience at the dentist on Friday. But if I do, I will be sure to update you later on this week during our final show of this current week. So welcome in once again to In Touch with Indiana Sports. Going to talk a lot of things. Indiana basketball, as I already mentioned, a few other things relating to that as well. We'll do a little bit of bracket forecasting and bracketology as promised from Monday. And there's a couple of other things I want to comment on as well. Matt Painter shared some thoughts on the IU job, and there's an article that was posted on HoosierIllustrated.com. I believe it was last night. If you want some more, I guess, non-perspective details, if that makes sense for me. If you want the actual written story, you can check that out on HoosierIllustrated.com. I believe it was our man Alec Lasley. Yes, it was who got that up there for us. And then a couple of other things that we'll get into towards the end if we have some time. Excuse me. But for now, let's go ahead and dive head first into some Indiana basketball discussion. And I don't want to talk too much because really Kyler and I hit on a ton, but I guess we can kind of introduce things here. This is not only an important game for Indiana because it's the next game, but it's important in general because you can't really afford any more losses from here on out. Really, if you want to be comfortably in the tournament, I'll say that. I think there's a pathway to making it in with a nice Big Ten tournament run if you drop a game in these Final Four contests. But I think your ideal scenario when you're thinking about that is the loss being to Oregon here, which they won't face them for another couple of matchups. I think with Penn State, they kind of have some momentum right now. Not that they're, playing for a lot. They do want to get into the Big Ten tournament, but their NCAA tournament hopes are pretty much all but over unless they make a run at winning the Big Ten championship game, the tournament championship game, I should say. So they're kind of fighting for their lives. And if Indiana has, a hangover game tonight, then they'll do what they've kind of always done this season, and that's follow up a big win with an unfortunate loss that I don't want to say would absolutely bury them. Now, if you get blown out by Penn State, that may bury you from making the NCAA tournament without making or winning the Big Ten tournament championship. So if you're Indiana, you don't even want to be flirting with a loss here. I think if you handle the business the way that you probably think you should, I'm going to go ahead and try to pull up the spread here and see what Vegas is currently saying about Indiana in tonight's matchup against Penn State. If I were before I even see this, I'm going to assume Indiana would probably be favored by 7.5, and here it is 6.5. I think that's, again, a fair spread. I think Indiana, if they want to look good for the committee, you not only cover that, but I think it would be great if you blew that out of the water. I think they absolutely have the ability to do that. But I think if Indiana disappoints tonight, I think that will all but solidify really just this team's identity being that they're inconsistent, because we've seen that they can beat some of the best of the best. We've seen them lose, not necessarily to the worst teams, but they've gotten blown out in occasions where they had no business being blown out. But it's one of those situations, if you're the Hoosiers, and I know they're like, Mike Woodson's job is no longer in jeopardy. I mean, it's already been decided what's going to happen at the end of the season when it comes to his job. So again, what you're playing for now, especially if you're looking at it from the fan perspective, you're just hoping that Indiana can find a way to get into the NCAA tournament and have fun in March Madness. It's been a long time since, especially in my neck of the woods, since all three of the major local teams have been in the NCAA tournament at the same time. And outside of Indiana, I'm, of course, referring to Louisville and Kentucky. And both of those teams already done more than enough to make sure that they're going to get into the NCAA tournament. Indiana, of course, still with a decent amount of work to do. But it would be fun, especially around here. March Madness, I forget how much of a buzz it really creates around these parts, because it's been so long since everybody has gotten to be a part of it. And, Kentucky's been there the last several years with John Calipari, even though they've bowed out early. But there's just something about that March Madness journey, even though it's been a long time since Indiana, not only to be in it, but, well, I say it's only been a couple of years since they've been in it, but to make a big run. It's been a long time since Indiana's had, somewhat of a journey. And I'm saying making at least the second weekend, because that's what really makes it feel like it's a little more worth your time if you can make it to that second weekend. If you bow out in the first couple of rounds, like, yeah, it's fun, but then you're like, okay, well, that was, we expected more out of this, and that ended up not being the case for whichever Indiana team you may be referring to. So who knows what'll happen? We'll look at some more brackets, in particular, or really just kind of where some guys have Indiana placed in their brackets. We'll look at Mike DeCourcy's bracket forecast, and we'll also take a look at Joe Lunardi's bracketology and see what they think of the Hoosiers and where they currently have them slated and how much work they may have left to do in order to feel more comfortable when it comes to Selection Sunday here in, I guess about a little less than a month, right? I mean, we're just a couple of days away from the month of March. And I know one thing that's always aggravated me, more of just like in a silly way, is when we get to March 1st and you see, the John Rothsteins. And I know John Rothstein's kind of like, he's not a bad guy by any stretch of the imagination, but John Rothstein is a basketball robot. That dude has nothing better to do than cover college basketball. And it almost seems like he has scheduled tweets for everything that he puts out, or, a certain format that he does. Like, he'll be the guy that tweets out this period. This will be in all caps too, by the way. This period is period March. And then everybody goes crazy. Blah, blah, blah. At least that's how he pictures it. And it's just kind of goofy and cringe. Might have been funny 5 or 10 years ago during Twitter's, not necessarily its infancy, but back when Twitter was more of, it was more cringy, I guess, and people didn't realize it was cringy until now. But I guess enough about John Rothstein. And the We Sleep in May too. Like, that's stupid. We sleep in April, the day that the tournament ends after April, whatever, April 3rd, April 4th, whatever day the national championship game happens to fall on this year. I think I'll take my sleep after the national championship game. I don't need to wait all the way till May, and I'll have a baby by then, so I got to take the sleep whenever I can get it at that point. So anyway, enough nonsense. Let's go ahead and continue talking some more Indiana basketball matters with our guy Kyler Staley, of course, of the HoosierIllustrated.com, and we'll talk more about Penn State. We'll talk about some head coaching stuff, and also I asked Kyler about Rick Pitino's, and we'll talk. I'll share some more thoughts on this on the other side as well. But I asked Kyler about his thoughts on Rick Pitino's endorsement of Chris Beard, and if that really means anything or amounts to anything, how much stock to put into it. And of course, we've discussed a number of other things as well. So without further ado, let's continue this conversation right Joining me now, of course, from HoosierIllustrated.com, it is none other than Kyler Staley, basketball recruiting analyst. Welcome back to In Touch with Indiana Sports, my friend.
Hey, thanks for having me back. It feels like it's been a long time since I've been on.
I know, with all of the post-game wrap-up shows, even the ones that I don't participate in, I feel like that's on top of all of the other duties that you have going on right now. It's kind of hard to make this work more often than it probably should.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been busy. It's been very, very busy. A lot of positives and negatives over the past month, with Indiana, but I'm actually excited to be on the show today because I feel like we got some positive vibes right now going on with the program this current season, especially, coming off of the Purdue win and everything, and seeing that kind of clear path, I guess, that you can say for Indiana to make the NCAA tournament right in front of them. Now, obviously, that's them like taking care of business and everything, but yeah. I think it's just nice that we're in a good spot right now with the program this current season, and obviously well beyond that.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and say this to you, since you were the kind of the person who steered me back in the right direction, because I was very quick to jump off of the Indiana's, or more like jump onto Indiana's not going to make the tournament, that bandwagon, as soon as Indiana lost to UCLA. Whereas I failed to kind of really just realize what was still ahead. And now all Indiana has to do, as you just mentioned, if they can take care of business. And I do think there would be some grace given if you lose to, say, in Oregon. I think you mentioned that previously as well. But if you can rack off a few wins here to close out the season, I think Indiana would be safely in the field of 68 without even winning a Big Ten tournament game potentially.
That's definitely a possibility. But like you said just a second ago, like it just goes to show you like how long of a season college basketball is, right? And especially when you look at Indiana and their schedule. I mean, looking back when the first part, I think I can remember when the schedule for the season was released or whatever, you looked at it, you were like, it's not really, not you in particular, but like just people just looking at it, just like, that's not really anything crazy or anything like that. But it ended up being one of the best things for Indiana this season just because of the opportunities that it had. So I will admit, the UCLA loss, it was, a fair accessibility with this team. Like, I don't know if they can really do it or whatever, but, them going on the road, beating Michigan State. They had a tough loss to, what was the Michigan State game before UCLA?
Yeah, it's weird. They have the two big wins sandwiched in between that UCLA loss.
That's where I was getting at. So you've got two huge quad one wins at Michigan State and then just beating Purdue, which that was a game that I feel like you needed. And I'll be honest with you, if they would have lost that game, I probably would have been in the, hey, there's probably not going to be enough that they can do to get in there. But game was just, they needed that game really, really bad. And you look at the last four games, Penn State at home, who you've already beaten on the road. And I dare to say, knock on wood, Penn State, I think, has gotten worse throughout the year. So you might be catching them, but you're catching them also at a time where they've won two straight. So they're getting hot, and they definitely are a well-coached team, and they got a lot of talent on there. Ace Baldwin, one of the best guards, obviously in the conference. And then you look at the West Coast trip, if you split that, and by splitting that, I mean you've got to beat Washington. You can't lose.
Yes, you can. That you can't throw because is that a Q4? It's not a Q4. It's probably a Q3.
It's probably going to be a quad 3, just because it's on the road or whatever and stuff. Now, I'm not saying that would kill you if you lost that game by 1 point, 2 points, something like that. But it still wouldn't be very good because you just need to do that. And if you were to keep it close against Oregon on the road, you not necessarily have to win that game. But if you keep it close versus Oregon on the road, that looks really good in the net rating wise. And then you round it off with Ohio State, which that Ohio State game might be a lot bigger than what it is right now because those are 2 bubble teams. That could be 2 bubble matchups or whatever. And obviously they had a really good game last month, one in overtime. Indiana did. So the opportunity is there for Indiana. The opportunity is there. And I do lean towards if you go at least 3-1 in this stretch and you beat the right teams, I think you can go into the Big Ten tournament without as much pressure as what you necessarily do. And if you win a game in the Big Ten tournament, that would just be a cherry on top. That's just my opinion, but obviously you got to look at a lot of the analytics as well.
Well, that's the thing. Like Indiana, it's a very weird situation that this team is in right now. Not only are the players able to kind of play more loose without all of the extra pressure on their backs from a month or so ago, but even Mike Woodson can kind of this is kind of a silly thing to say because he has no hair, but Mike Woodson can let his hair down, maybe let his beard down.
He can let his goatee down a little bit.
Let his goatee down because he's playing with house money, as I just mentioned. I mean, he probably had one of the coolest moments the other day with the Bob Knight chair in the middle of Assembly Hall after the win against Purdue. And it's also very kind of, you think about his tenure. His first big moment with Indiana was that crazy win with Big Shot Rob at Assembly Hall in his opening season. He's kind of bookending his very kind of unfortunately short tenure at Indiana with 2 wins over his rival, who he also has, of course, ties to from being an IU alum. So it's kind of, I don't want to call it, a happy storybook ending per se, because there have been a lot of bumps along the way, but I do feel like Woodson is going to be able to kind of have a gracious exit, more so than people really ever would have imagined after how things began going through with the season.
You know what I love about that moment? Obviously, the Bob Knight chair and everything like that. I think the best moment of the whole time was the entire basketball team, entire Indiana team rallying around their coach. It goes to show you, there's a lot of rumors, a lot of speculation, with this team. Like, there's some guys that don't like to play for Mike Woodson and blah, blah, blah and stuff. Every single one of them were over there rubbing on his head. They were giving him the biggest hug in the world. So it was a pretty emotional moment. I ain't gonna lie. You could sense the emotions in Assembly Hall and just feel that vibe in there. And, over the last few weeks, it has been, I guess sad is the right word, because I think when you looked at a lot of Indiana fans, especially after the first 2 years, you wanted this thing to work. And you could tell how much Mike Woodson does love the university and stuff. And like you said, he's playing with house money and everything, but he's also going to play with the right guys, the guys that want to win and stuff. And he's going to give them the opportunity. He's rolling with the seniors right now, especially the in-state kids of Galloway, Goody, Leal. He's rolling with those guys. Malik, the guy that's been there, when you look at the front court, that's been there the longest and whatnot. So he's going to play the guys that are going to help win and help project them or propel them into the NCAA tournament. So you can tell the team is playing for him. They're playing for each other, and they're just playing hard right now. They're playing with a lot of effort, and especially that Purdue game, that second half, they could have easily rolled over, especially when Purdue went on that run to close out the half, and they didn't do that. They want to play. They want to make the NCAA tournament, and they want to do whatever they can to get into that NCAA tournament.
I want to ask you, too, I feel like in the Purdue game, we saw something that we haven't seen from Indiana in a very long time. Anytime they usually get punched in the mouth, that's the moment they fold. And I think a lot of people, especially recently, think of the Wisconsin game. Well, you kind of had that happen midway through the first half against Purdue. And for the first time, Indiana punched back, and they just kept punching, and they kept punching. And there's a lot of factors that probably go into how, things played out to get the win that they ended up getting against the Boilermakers. Of course, being your rival, Mike, just less pressure, as we already talked about. But do you think this is a real turning point, or is it more of just kind of a flash in the pan? Because we won't know until tomorrow when they play, or I should say today, by the time this gets released, when they play Penn State. But do you tend to think that this is a sign of things to genuinely transform in this final stretch of the season?
I think that's kind of tough for Indiana because, it has been rocky. It has been up and down a lot with this team, and consistency has been kind of the key term for this team. There's times where, especially game in and game out, they look phenomenal. They're playing really well. They're hitting shots. The rotations look good. And then there's a game right after that where they don't look good. They don't look like a team that gels or has good chemistry or whatnot. My gut feeling says this is a turning point because they got that big win at home that they desperately needed. They showed that they can go on the road and beat Michigan State. These last 2 wins that they have, and they were so close. They did everything that they could to come back and almost beat UCLA, but I'll give credit where credit's due. UCLA is a phenomenal team, and they were a well-coached team, and they just had an answer for everything. So you got to give respect to them in that. But Indiana did whatever they could. They were one or two few mistakes from getting another win right there that would have really helped them. But, when you look at the Penn State game on Wednesday night, it's a game that you just can't lose. You can't fall flat on your face. And honestly, to me, I feel like you do got to win by at least 10 points or so with that, and win kind of in convincing fashions to stay on the right side of the bubble. Because honestly, you look at the committee, the people that obviously, do all the brackets or whatnot. Joe Lenhardy is a very tied into that or whatever. They're going to look for any reason to keep Indiana off of, in that NCAA tournament just for the content wise of it. So it's a tough one to say just because Indiana, consistency has been the thing. But for me personally, gut feeling, I say having that big win against Purdue, proving you can go on the road and beat Michigan State. I do think that this is going to be a turning point for Indiana, and they can finish out strong this regular season.
And I also want to kind of talk about something wild. I mentioned this a little bit on Monday's show. But if we go back to the beginning of the season, talking expectations, we know that the personnel on this team can get it done. The problem is they've just not been able to gel consistently at any point this season. Is it crazy to say? Because I think some people would say it is, but I do think we ought to at least humor that there is a chance that if things can gel at the right time, that this team, if they make the NCAA tournament, I think they can make a run to at least the second weekend, maybe further. And I'm not saying they should. I'm not saying they will. But I think if the talent truly is what we've said it's been all season long, it just hasn't gelled together. I don't think it's necessarily too far out of left field to think that that's, at least in some way, shape, or form, a possibility.
Look, there's a lot of things, to unpack there. NCAA tournament time, anything can happen. Yeah. It's a clean slate, right? And honestly, the team that I saw in the second half of the Indiana-Purdue game, that Indiana team, there's no way if I was any other coach, any other team in the NCAA tournament, would I want to play an 11 seed, 12 seed Indiana team like that, just played like that. So, I think for Indiana, obviously you got to finish out strong in the regular season. And you also look, Mike Woodson said a lot of times, and a lot of people rolled their eyes when they said that he's still trying to figure out this team. He's still trying to figure out what works and stuff. It took a lot longer than what it needed to. And that's kind of, the reason why we're kind of in this predicament as well, with Mike Woodson having to step down and all that stuff. But he was right in a little bit of a way. If you really think about it, he was still trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And that may be from game to game. We've seen McKenzie and Baco have really, really strong games or whatever. And then there's games where it's just not his night. And that was always going to kind of be the part of this team. They had so much depth to it. There's going to be guys that it's not their night, and you're going to hope that somebody would have stepped up. It's just all about putting the pieces together. And I think right now you've really seen that this Indiana team is about to come into their complete form. It starts with the front court. I thought Indiana, Mike Woodson, and their staff did a great job subbing in and out. Malik Renew, obviously Malik got in foul trouble when it comes to the second half. And honestly, he may have played all those 20 minutes because Mike Woodson only played those 6 guys. But I think he's found something there. I really do think he has. And obviously you just got to be ready if your guys are going to be on the bench or whatever. You guys just got to be they just got to be ready when their name is called, and honestly just be ready to contribute. But back to your original question, this Indiana team in the NCAA tournament getting hot at the right moment, I wouldn't want to play an 11, 12 seed Indiana team. Honestly, that would just be a really tough matchup for anybody.
Yeah. And of course, and before I want to transition into another topic, Kyler, I believe you and I talked. I don't remember if this was off the air or on the air, but we've talked about March 1st. We say that should be the actual start of the new year because of, it's March. It's college basketball. Spring is on its way.
It is.
I don't remember if we had that conversation off the air, but for some reason, the way you just laid out everything, it reminded me of that. And of course, with things kind of changing for Indiana, things becoming anew, if you will, it definitely adds a bit of positive energy to everything that's going on. But I do want to briefly switch topics while we've got a few more minutes. I want to ask you about Rick Pitino's comment, or really endorsement, I should say, of Chris Beard to be the next Indiana men's basketball coach. I'll just open the floor to you. Your thoughts on what was said, and if you think that's even a realistic possibility right now.
Do you want my complete honest opinion on the whole thing?
Of course, yeah. I want the complete honest opinion, because for me, before I hand it over to you, I'm somebody who, without all the baggage, I think Chris Beard is the perfect Indiana basketball head coach. But the problem is he has the baggage, and when you're Indiana right now, is that the risk you are willing to take for somebody like that? So with that being said, I'll toss it back over to you.
Yeah, and I'm going to put all my chips on the table right here. So I could be, eating my words here in a few months, but Chris Beard's not going to be the guy, in my opinion, that Indiana hires, strictly because, and I'll be the, first to admit, you look at his on the court stuff. He is a great coach, X's and O's wise. He knows what he's doing. He's had great team after great team. Took an Ole Miss team that really, nobody really cared about. They were in the bottom of the SEC. And got them back to being relevant and being a team that could make a deep run in the NCAA tournament. But you mentioned it. It's the baggage, right? And I think if you're Indiana, obviously they're using that search firm. They're going through all the steps that they necessarily need to or whatnot. There could be a point where Indiana, uses that search firm and they look deep into Chris Beard's history and all that stuff. And like, you know what? Maybe we can take a risk with him. But to me personally, when you look at those types of situations, the domestic violence and all that stuff, when you look at that stuff, it's just 9 times out of 10, those things just pop up again. And I don't think if you're Indiana and you look at that, I don't think you want to take that risk, because let's say if you do hire him or whatnot, there's 2 years where he's doing really good for Indiana and stuff. There's always going to be in the back of the heads of the fans of, the athletic department of just that black cloud. Like, okay, what if something does happen here and whatnot? And I think for Indiana, you can't take that risk. They got to stop with the off court issues that they have year in and year out. There's always something that pops up. And I think you have to get away from that. Chris Beard's a great coach. He really is. He's a great coach and stuff, but you just can't take that risk. And honestly, when you look at it, Indiana's got to look around the country as well. Last year, Michigan, Kentucky, Louisville, all those schools were open. There's a reason why those guys didn't go after Chris Beard. And Chris Beard, I'm not saying that he's always going to have this black cloud over him or anything like that. But it takes time. These things really do take time. And I think he just hasn't had enough time for it to clear out or whatever and stuff, and proven that, everything's in the past or whatever. I just don't think if you're Indiana, you can take that risk right now. He's a great coach. He'd win a lot of games, but you got to think of the off-court stuff. That's just my opinion. I'm laying all my chips there. I don't think Chris Beard's going to be the guy.
And you're not the only person I've talked to that's mentioned that. I think that's a very high possibility of being true. And here's the other thing that Indiana fans, myself included, need to remember. Unless I'm wrong about something, or unless there's a surprise job opening, Indiana is going to be the best coaching job by far this offseason that opens up. Now, maybe I'm wrong about something. Maybe there's something last minute that comes up that I'm unaware of, or that we're not even thinking about right now. But Indiana, though they may not get the big Power 4 name or Power 5 name, whatever it may be, they're going to have their shot at almost whoever they want, especially at the mid-major level. Somebody who's like a Ben McCollum, that's somebody else I've thrown out a bunch. Indiana's going to have probably a lot of really good options once they've kind of vetted everybody that is interested in the job. And it's really just going to come down to if Scott Dolson can make the correct decision at that point.
Scott Dawson, obviously everyone likes to go back with Kurt Cignetti and whatnot and stuff. I try not to always tie that together, because let's face it, Kurt Cignetti, man, that could be a once-in-a-lifetime type of hire right there.
Yeah,
we just don't know. I mean, that's just kind of how it is and stuff. So I don't think Scott Dolson has as much pressure as what people kind of give him. I think he's going to do a good job. I think he is going to get the right guy, and there's a lot of options out there. And he's going to go through the list. He's going to make the phone calls. He's going to be like, "Are you interested in it?" I look at the Iowa State head coach Otzenberger. Otzenberger. I can't remember exactly
but it's okay.
Otzenberger. If he is the Indiana head coach, that's going to take me a little bit. But anyway, he's an intriguing option, but obviously he's got strong ties to Iowa State as well. Ben McCollum's a guy that you mentioned or whatnot, so he gives the Kirk Cignetti vibes, come from the mid-major level, and he's a guy he's probably going to be your fifth or sixth option if he gets down to that or whatnot. People, want to talk about Scott Drew. That's another intriguing option. Mick Cronin's another one. Again, I probably don't see him being the Indiana head coach.
Yeah, I gotta say, I've said before, as much as well as he did against Indiana with that UCLA team, he's had not the same exact. It's not even really off the court issues. He's just kind of a mouth, when it comes to the media, and I don't think that's something that would really mesh well with the Indiana culture. And we've kind of seen it wasn't the exact same thing with Archie Miller, but Archie Miller had a very just kind of non-Bloomington. It's probably the only way to say it, really. He didn't really fit the Bloomington, hometown type of vibe. Mick Cronin doesn't fit that either, and that's why I just don't think he's someone that would mesh well with the IU program.
Probably not, and that's kind of the reason why I kind of look at that and stuff. So, but he is a great coach, so don't get me wrong. But, I mean, here's the thing. Like, these next, we got 4 weeks or so of this probably and stuff. Like, it's going to be a lot of speculation, and honestly, I don't think you'll see any meat to any of this until, let's say, that head coach. He's probably going to be coaching in the NCAA tournament until that head coach is, out of there or whatever and stuff, or until Indiana's season comes to an end. So it's fun to speculate right now. I think Indiana fans are having a fun time speculating, and, a lot of them are waving the Chris Beard flag or waving the Ben McCollum flag or whatever and stuff. They got their guys and whatnot. So that's fun in a lot of ways. But I mean, I just, just kind of prepared. Nothing's going to happen until it gets to, late March, if at earliest. So there's a lot of intriguing options right there. And I do agree with you. Indiana, I think, is going to be the best opening in any college basketball opening this offseason.
Last question, and then we'll wrap this thing up. Bruce Pearl, I feel like, is the name that, although seems unrealistic, I think he's the name that most people I feel like Indiana fans are unified on if they were able to pull off that sort of poaching from Auburn. Is there any scenario you see him leaving to come to IU?
I absolutely do. I mean, honestly, when I think of it, if I had a choice, he's probably the number one option, right?
He's my number one option right now, I feel like.
Yeah. I mean, he checks off all the boxes. Let's just say that. And you can say, like, well, what about his age or whatever? There's a difference between an old 65, like Mike Woodson is right now, and a young 65, like Bruce Pearl is.
Like
Bruce Pearl's
Kirk Cignetti's a young 64 or 65, whatever he is.
Yeah, so we'll say that right there. So, like, there's a difference in that. It's just whatever it is. But Bruce Pearl, man, I became a huge fan of him when Auburn beat Indiana in Atlanta, just for him and him talk and how much respect he has for the Indiana program. Bob Knight, he coached at Southern Indiana in Evansville, so he's got the Indiana ties. And me being on the recruiting trail or whatnot, I noticed that he does recruit the state pretty well. He offers a lot of in-state kids. He necessarily doesn't get commitments out of them, but he does recruit the state of Indiana pretty well. Flory Badunga was one that he really, really went after. Jalen Harrelson as well. So in-state guys. So he would have that. He would have that kind of feel to it or whatnot. So, but it's going to be really, really hard to get him away from Auburn. But if you are going to get him away from Auburn, I think this is going to be the year to do it, especially because if Auburn goes in, wins the national championship, he's done everything he needed to do with this Auburn team. He can go into Indiana, and you don't even have to call it a rebuild. I don't think there's necessarily any true rebuilds nowadays when you look at the college basketball landscape of NIL, the transfer portal, all that stuff. He can come in. He'll probably bring some guys with him from Auburn as well. And I think he would have success in Indiana. I think he would get them back to contending for Final Fours at the very least. So he'd be phenomenal. He would be the number one option. He'd probably be my first call if I had a choice, if I was Scott Dolson. But it's just going to be really hard. So you just want to be hopeful that at least he'll consider it at this point.
Kyler Staley, thank you as always. Of course, check out everything that he's writing on HoosierIllustrated.com. And of course, check out the Talking About the Hoosiers podcast. Is anything coming out this Thursday or anything specific?
Probably not. We may have one next week. I'm going to be out of town for a work thing, but I think Drew will probably have something going on, maybe with Alec or something. But there's going to be a podcast coming soon. We'll probably towards the end of the Indiana basketball season, we'll probably do a more focused coaching hot board as well. But there's a lot to talk about with Indiana right now, so there's still a current season going on. But yeah, I would expect next week we'll have a podcast.
Well, thank you as always, and be sure to check out tonight. We are doing a post-game wrap-up show, right? We haven't really – that's something we can talk about off air, but are we doing post-game wrap-up? Is that something we should be promoting right now?
Yeah. Well, yeah, for sure. I will be in Assembly Hall. Alec will be in Assembly Hall, so we'll definitely do a post-game wrap-up.
All righty. Kyler Staley, appreciate you as always. We'll do this again very soon. A big thanks to Kyler as always, and be sure to check out tonight's post-game wrap-up show. I will not be featured on it, but either Drew or Dylan will likely be standing by with Kyler this evening as they discuss everything that goes down between Indiana and Penn State. And then I'll react to it on Friday. Yippee-ki-yay. So moving forward, I want to share some final thoughts on the Chris Beard stuff. And I know Kyler mentioned that he would be very surprised if Chris Beard would be the coach here. And I don't know if he was saying that from like an insider, like knowing something, or if he just thinks that the baggage is too much. I would be on board with assuming that could probably be the case, the baggage part of it. And here's the other thing with Rick Pitino. I feel like Pitino's coming from a place where he kind of can relate to Chris Beard, just because Pitino kind of feels like he was wronged at Louisville in a lot of ways. And I don't know if Chris Beard necessarily feels the exact same way about a situation at Texas, but his charges were dropped. And again, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen or didn't happen, the domestic violence situation that allegedly took place. But it does, it's the reason he's coaching right now at Ole Miss. So it would be very interesting to see if Chris Beard's given the job, that's the first thing people are going to mention whenever, maybe even before they mention the on the court stuff. And wherever he ends up getting a job next, like Chris Beard will eventually, maybe I'm wrong about this, because he is already in the SEC. He's in the Power Five. You're in the best conference, one of the two best conferences, not only in basketball, but just in sports in general right now. You're kind of set. Now, Ole Miss is always kind of going to be the lower tier, especially in basketball for the SEC. But if he ever wants a bigger job and he continues to have success at Ole Miss, he'll have another shot, even if it's not Indiana. Now, if I were guessing, I'm sure he is interested in the Indiana job. Will he get it? Who knows? He just seems like the kind of guy, especially after the comments he made about Bob Knight very recently, especially on the heels of everything that was going down with Mike Woodson at the time. I think that Chris Beard, if he's offered the job, I think he'd 100% take it. Now, I don't know if he'll be offered it. So I don't know. I'm curious how far down the line would people have to say no for Scott Dolson to offer Chris Beard? Because I'm sure there is, kind of a hierarchy of candidates, and maybe Chris Beard gets knocked down a few notches because of all of the off the court stuff. So who knows? I don't know if I've ever explicitly said this on the podcast just yet, but I kind of am falling into the camp that Scott Dolson, and again, me saying this right now, it doesn't mean a whole lot. I don't know Scott Dolson personally or anything like that. But based on the success of Curt Cignetti, I would not be surprised, especially if, Indiana goes for some of the home run hires and misses on those, or they just, they're comfortable where they're at and they don't want to take on a high pressure job like Indiana. I would not be surprised one bit if Ben McCollum is higher up on people's lists, or excuse me, I would not be surprised if Ben McCollum is higher up on Scott Dolson's list than people would expect because of the, how Curt Cignetti worked out. Now, that may have just been a once in a lifetime type of hire, something that, you can never, that will never happen again in a million years for anybody. And that may be a bit exaggerated, but I think Ben McCollum, there's a good chance that whoever snatches him up, whether it's Indiana, Iowa, Virginia. I really think he'll be at one of those three schools, maybe in that order, like in terms of those are the jobs he would take depending on when they're offered or when they get filled, that sort of thing. And I think he's going to do great. I think he'll do great wherever he's at, just because you look, he's won everywhere. No, I say everywhere. He's won for a long time, mostly at the Division II level, and this is his first season at Drake. And let me pull up his exact record. I don't know it off the top of my head, but he's having a phenomenal season in the Missouri Valley. And he's likely going to unless he's also shown that he's loyal, so maybe he will stick around for more than one season. But his one season at Drake right now, he's 25-3. And I am curious too now, while we are kind of talking Ben McCollum, I'm going to go ahead and pull up Drake's schedule. And I know they play in the Missouri Valley Conference, so I know that their conference schedule isn't necessarily something to be, something to be excited about. Like, they don't play a lot of really, really good teams night in and night out in the Missouri Valley, but it has had some really good teams in the past. Indiana State, Murray State's now in the MVC, and a couple of others, Wichita State before they moved on. So the Missouri Valley Conference has always been kind of the middle tier of, really kind of the upper middle tier, I should say, of the mid-majors. And so Drake, or him right now at Drake, by the way, and I know I'm just kind of rambling here as I'm looking at some different things. But Drake currently sitting atop the standings in the Missouri Valley, and it's not super close. In conference-wise it is, but overall record, it's quite a big gap. Drake being 25-3, Northern Iowa second place, 19-10. But I'm curious if any of those 25 wins for Ben McCollum, are they worth, getting excited about? How many Power 4, Power 5 teams have they defeated? And actually, I'm looking at it right now. Miami, they defeated them 80-69. They defeated Vanderbilt 81-70. They defeated Kansas State 73-70. And what else? Their three losses this year: UIC on the road 74-70, Murray State at home 66-59, and then Bradley at home 61-59. So those are kind of the highlights, I guess, of what they've been able to do in his first season in Drake. Is it Drake, Iowa? Is that like the town, or is Drake something else? Either way, it doesn't really matter a whole lot. I do think whoever ends up taking Ben McCollum will be getting I wouldn't say a diamond in the rough. I think McCollum is getting a lot more attention right now than Curt Cignetti was getting. And really, Curt Cignetti, a lot of people didn't really buy into his stuff until after he had some results. And it even took people a little bit longer than that, really getting into the playoff, I feel like, before people really bought in. I'm not talking Indiana, but outsiders. Maybe I'm understating it or overstating it too much. Whichever version of that phrase I'm looking for at the moment. But the noise for Curt Cignetti was mostly created around Bloomington before anything ever took place. Regardless, let's move on to some other things now. I want to get into some bracket forecasting and some bracketology. I feel like for Mike DeCourcy's bracket forecasting, it needs to look more like a weather forecast. And I don't know if you've I'm not going to pull up the different images he has, but I feel like you need to fully dive into the forecasting analogy with this. But either way, I'll just go ahead and say this: both Mike DeCourcy and Joe Lunardi have Indiana currently in their first four out. And I don't know if if it's left to right, who's next in, but Mike DeCourcy currently has them, if that's the case. Mike DeCourcy currently has Indiana as third in their first four outs. And then Lunardi has Indiana at second, ahead of them being North Carolina, and then SMU and Xavier below them. I didn't mention on Mike DeCourcy who is below him or below them, but Ohio State is the first team out for Mike DeCourcy. Texas, number 2. Of course, the Hoosiers at 3, and then North Carolina at 4. Excuse me while I cough really fast. But for Indiana, I think this clearly shows that the Hoosiers are firmly in the conversation, especially with the amount of games that are left and the amount of really mediocre teams that are still in the hunt for an NCAA tournament bid. Indiana definitely, I don't want to say they control their own destiny, but they do. They do, but they don't, right? Because the other teams also can boost their resumes as well. But one of these teams, Ohio State in particular, these two teams will battle it out at the very end of the season. That's Indiana's final regular season game. And depending on where things stand for both of those teams, that could be an elimination game for the loser of that one. And of course, the winner getting to potentially snag one of the final spots. Now, if Indiana goes on and beats Penn State and Washington, and if Indiana's 4-0, I think they will have, and I guess it'd be 5 straight at that point. If Indiana wins their final 5 games, going back to their Purdue matchup this past weekend, I think Indiana, based on both of these projections, I think Indiana will have done enough to get an at-large. Maybe I'm wrong. Of course, both DeCourcy and Lenardi, those brackets are not gospel, but they tend to be at least fairly accurate. I know there's a way that they, like all the different bracket experts, they rank them at the end of the year based on how accurate they were compared to the actual field of 68. And I don't remember how good Lenardi did last year, but Mike DeCourcy is usually, and I'm not just saying this because he came on the show a couple of weeks ago, but Mike DeCourcy has had some pretty close brackets, not necessarily when it comes to exact seeding and, where they, who they play against, that sort of thing. But with the teams that get in versus those that don't, DeCourcy is usually more accurate than Joe Lenardi, I do believe. So I do lean towards looking at Mike DeCourcy's bracket. I know Lenardi's just the guy that everybody, goes to because he kind of, I guess, invented this whole bracket predicting thing. At least he popularized it. So, and then other teams of note, I know I mentioned Louisville and Kentucky, at least around my neck of the woods. Louisville currently falls as a 6 seed. They would play the winner of San Diego State and Georgia. And Kentucky falls as a 4 seed, facing 13 seed Utah Valley. And they both would be in the same bracket out in the West. So, no, I'm looking at Mike DeCourcy's, by the way. Looking at Joe Lenardi's, his bracket, I'm not going to sit here and analyze it too much right now. Lenardi's got Kentucky as a 3, facing JMU in the South. And then they also got Louisville as a 7, facing West Virginia in the East. So we'll see if Indiana can do enough to be a part of this conversation in the coming weeks, more so than they are right now. It is fun that Indiana has a chance. As I mentioned previously, I really did write them off a bit earlier than I should, and I'm sure many of you did that as well. And a lot of that's just due to frustration with how things have gone, not only this season, but the last couple of seasons, and just not living up to expectations and, that sort of thing. It can kind of sour the overall college basketball viewing experience. Am I wrong? And with that being said, actually, before I get into this, I do want to mention one more little tidbit that Mike DeCourcy notes on. I didn't even know about this. Maybe this makes me ignorant, or I guess it does technically make me ignorant, but maybe I should have known about this, is what I'm saying. But Mike DeCourcy has 3 teams labeled in their first 4 out and next 4 out with a crown over top, one of those being Indiana. And what that is, again, I'm sure many of you already knew this before I even did. So the top 2 teams not selected for the NCAA tournament from each of the following conferences, the Big East, the Big 12, and the Big 10, they will receive an automatic bid to what is known as the College Basketball Crown Tournament, which I don't know if it's fully taking the place of the NIT. It kind of appears to be that way. But I clicked on @CBB Crown on Twitter, and it kind of explains what this is. It's going to be broadcast on Fox and FS1, and it makes sense because most of really all of the conferences involved in this are affiliated with the Fox Sports networks. And this will be out in Las Vegas, by the way. But I do believe this is, I don't know how many teams participate in this, and I don't really know if Indiana were to miss the NCAA tournament, would they want to participate in this. I mean, you got a lot of reasons to do so because you have a lot of players who are playing their final season of college basketball and more than likely won't have an NBA career. Now, maybe they'll go play overseas or that sort of thing. And of course, Mike Woodson will be his last opportunity to coach this team. But also, you kind of get a slow start on some other things, hiring a new coach. Maybe you can still hire a new coach while this is going on. It'd be kind of odd to do that, but maybe it wouldn't be at the same time. So maybe Indiana will, if they miss out on March Madness, maybe they'll be playing in this new thing known as the College Basketball Crown. And again, it will only feature Big Ten, Big East, and Big 12 teams, it looks like. So you can be the champion of those three conferences, whatever that, not even really the champion, because the best teams will be in the NCAA tournament. You can be kind of a champion in the college basketball. It's kind of like winning the Pop-Tarts Bowl or any of those other subpar bowl games, if you will. So yeah, I just wanted to include that. Didn't want to forget that before I moved on. But I noticed I was segueing whenever I was talking about fans being frustrated. I was segueing into something, into that Matt Painter conversation that I kind of teased, sort of previewed at the beginning of the show. But he commented the other night on really the Indiana job in general, and he spit some truth. And there's, I'll just read it verbatim right here and give my thoughts afterward. And I may read it in chunks, some of his quotes. But here's what Matt Painter says right here. A fan base isn't the people who tweet. A fan base is the people when you're bleeding, they support you. They jump on and off things here way too much. Support your coach, man. Support your players. Don't tweet negative things about them. Be supportive. See how that works for you. I agree and disagree with that. And I'll start with what I agree with. I agree that, the Twitter sphere, X sphere, however you want to refer to it as, that place is nonsense. And, I enjoy being on Twitter, of course, but the negativity is usually just people who are screaming behind the internet wall and tweeting at players, coaches. Like, that's stupid. That's those people have never been a good representation of the fan base, and they really don't represent a majority of the fan base. But here's one thing he says that I kind of disagree with in a way. He says a fan base is the people when you're bleeding, they support you. Now, depending on how you look at it, like if Matt Painter is saying that fans should just blindly cheer for their team when things are not going well, I don't agree with that, because when you can see that something is not working out, I think you're being a good fan by wanting things to improve and to move on and try something different. It doesn't mean that you're not supporting the program. It doesn't even mean that you're not supporting the coach. And I think Mike Woodson's an interesting example with all this, because one thing we talked about before we knew he was going to retire at the end of the season, step away, however you want to view it. One thing we talked about was what would be the best case scenario, like if you're a fan. And I go back to this comment because I'm sure he or she wasn't the only person to mention this, or even the first person, but somebody commented on one of our previous episodes before all of this came to be, that the best case scenario, if you're a fan, is Indiana gets to finish the season on a positive note and Mike Woodson rides off into the sunset. And that's exactly what's happening, because nobody wants to see things get ugly, especially when an alum is involved, like Mike Woodson, of course. And so the way things were getting very gross and disgusting with all of the booing at Assembly Hall by the students, fans, whatever. And thankfully, all of that kind of came to a screeching halt once the weight was lifted and it was announced that Mike Woodson will be stepping away. And as of right now, it looks like that's the best decision that could have happened. But a lot of that's because of how insane the fan base is as well. Like, maybe Indiana shouldn't have had to do that. And with that being said, I want to get back into more of what Matt Painter was saying. And there are some expletives in here, just an FYI. But here's more of what Matt Painter said on the Indiana job. And he's referring to the fans whenever he says this. And it's not just Indiana fans, too. I want to kind of make sure I'm clarifying that. He's not just talking about Indiana fans. A lot of fan bases are like this. But he says this. They, the fans, build them up and they overdo things, like quit overdoing shit. Just accurately talk about what's actually happening. Don't get recruits and then be like, that's Michael Jordan. That's Scottie Pippen. And then they come here and they're not like Michael Jordan or Scottie Pippen. They're good college players. They build it up and then go, oh, what's wrong? Well, they, the fans, they're a part of it. I guess he was referring to the issues. And I have noticed this too, especially when it comes to recruiting. And I know recruiting's a lot different now when you factor in the transfer portal. But I feel like, and being in someone from Kentucky fans do the same thing. Whenever Indiana would get a recruit, it didn't matter if it's an in-state guy, if it's somebody, actually, it was usually more so if it was an in-state guy. Fans act like, and I think Romeo Langford is a prime example. People acted like Romeo Langford was the savior of the universe. And yeah, was he a good player? Yeah. Did he do good things at Indiana? Yeah, of course. But the team he was on was hardly worth talking about. I couldn't even tell you what year that was anymore. That team didn't do anything. And he Romeo Langford, barely had much of a career in the NBA. Now, I don't know who that's to blame, but Indiana fans, I don't want to speak for the entire population, but like Matt Painter does make a good point when he says that because of how serious a good, really you could say the legacy fans of Indiana basketball take everything on occasion, especially the in-state recruits and the really good ones, things get way too overhyped, way too fast. And I know Romeo Langford it doesn't line up with Mike Woodson's tenure per se, but with certain guys and certain, things that happen, things have always gotten way too inflated when it comes to expectations. I don't think it was inflated to expect Indiana to be contending for the Big Ten title this year. I'm not saying that at all. But there have been different moments here and there where, because it's Indiana, everything gets heightened to a different level. Like if Romeo Langford would have gone somewhere else, would it have been as big of a deal? No, because he was an in-state guy. And honestly, Romeo Langford wouldn't have even gone to Indiana if it weren't for all of the nonsense that was going on at Louisville at the time. So he didn't Indiana was Romeo Langford's number 2 choice. So anyway, I feel like I got on my soapbox a little bit there, and I hope I didn't say anything too out of line. But I do think Matt Painter was making some really good points whenever, and I'll mention the last part of his quote too, because it does kind of reiterate something I was saying earlier. He says, but it's not their total fan base. It's just that everyone has a bad percentage of their fan base now because of Twitter, and then we think that's their fan base. It's not our fan base, and it's not their real fan base either. And so I think that's an important piece. So yeah, I want to throw that in there as well. So I thought it was very interesting. And I kind of hope that this new generation coming in of Indiana fan, maybe there's no stopping it, but let's just tone down the nonsense a little bit. And maybe that's not possible, but it'd be great if that were the case. I used to be part of the nonsense. Sometimes you have to outgrow the nonsense or just have a moment where you have rock bottom with nonsense. And I don't know if this necessarily is, falls under the category of nonsense. I know I've said that word a lot now, but back whenever, I was in high school when this happened, mind you, but back whenever Indiana, this was in Tom Crean's, it was the season they won the Big Ten championship. But the year they lost to Ohio State at home, and if they had won, they would have clinched the Big Ten title outright, which they ended up doing against Michigan a game later, I believe, on the road. But when they lost that home game to Ohio State, I cried because I was like, this Indiana team is better than that. There's no reason that they should have lost to Ohio State on senior night with guys like Jordan Holes, Derek Elston, Christian Watford, that whole group. I was like, this is their night, and they need to take care of business, and they didn't do that. That was rock bottom for me, realizing, okay, this is a little bit ridiculous. And again, when you're younger, it's easier to look up and kind of see college players as, kind of role models. They're close to being pro players. Like, it's different. And maybe that's why I have a different outlook on it now, because most of these guys playing, and I say most because some of these guys are my age still, because of the COVID years and stuff like that. But most of these guys are younger than me, and they'll continue to be younger than me because I'm going to continue to get older, and college basketball players will always be somewhere in that 18 to 22, 23, 24-year-old range. So that's my story on how on one time where I was too much of a fan. And maybe I've told that story before. I'm not too sure, but either way, I think that was worth mentioning. We'll get into some other stuff on the next episode on Friday. We'll talk more about some of the smaller things. One of the Chris Vanini thing, I don't know if I'd even previewed this, but the Big Ten and the SEC and the other conferences had some conversations about the future of the college football playoff. We may discuss more of that on Friday, and we'll get into a number of other things as well. But we're going to go ahead and wrap up today's episode. Appreciate you as always. Feel free to leave a comment. Please subscribe if you haven't already and you enjoy this show or the other content we have on HoosierIllustrated.com. And give me a follow if you want. I don't really say that a lot, but my Twitter is not always the most interesting, so you don't have to. But if you want to, at Alden on the Air, and check out everything going on, as always, with Kyler Staley, Alec Lasley, Drew Rosenberg, and Dylan Traeger at HoosierIllustrated.com. So until then, until Friday, this has been another episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com.